Greetings, everyone. I'm Kelsey LaBelle. I'm the Director of Content Strategy here at DomainTools, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Proactively Deter Threats with IB Hotlist. So our speakers today will be Pat McGarry, who's the Chief Technical Officer at Bandura, as well as Dan Fernandez, who's the Senior Product Manager of Data at DomainTools. And just a few housekeeping items here before we get started. All of you are in listen only mode. So if you're screaming into the void, we can't hear you, use that questions panel and we'll be a lot more helpful. Feel free to ask those at any point during the session. We typically answer them during the end, but just know that I am there available and keeping a close eye on those. Additionally, we're recording this webinar and we have the slides and we'll make both of those available to you after the fact. You should be receiving an email from me in 24 to 48 hours with all those details. And we also have it available on the site. If you have any burning questions or want to review the content directly after, that will be available to you too. And finally, if you're on Twitter, please follow along at #DTWebinar and join the conversation with your own tweets. Puns are greatly appreciated. And with that, I'm just going to read some bios here for our lovely speakers. So you can stare at their faces in stereo between the slides here and their webcams. So we have Pat McGarry, and Pat has more than 25 years of hands-on experience in all aspects of hardware and software development, to include iterative requirements analysis, architecture, engineering, test, managerial, and leadership roles. His skills have been brought to bear across a wide variety of technology-related disciplines, including embedded system design, network systems analysis and design, advanced network testing, cybersecurity, deployable machine learning and artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, big data, advanced data analytics, and high-performance heterogeneous computing. He's been granted 3 US patents and has spoken at a variety of user and industry conferences. He received bachelor's degrees in computer science and electrical engineering, along with a minor in math, all from Virginia Tech. Next up, we have Dan Fernandez. And both of you, feel free to do jazz fingers, you know, when you're called here. But Dan is a senior product manager at DomainTools, and in his role, he leads the efforts to augment internally developed and third-party threat intelligence data sources, deliver agile data processing, and the data strategy that powers DomainTools' vision to map the internet's infrastructure. His background is in technical product management focused on data and analytics products for the last 8 years. His experience includes leading product management for data platforms ranging from high-frequency trading and risk applications to financial crime management applications. Dan is particularly interested in data security, data privacy, and large-scale data processing. He is currently a graduate student in cybersecurity at Georgia Institute of Technology, focusing on the intersection of data analytics and information security. So with that, I'm excited to have you take it away, Dan.
Sure, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the great introduction. So we wanted to start today by talking a little bit about DomainTools and our data in the context of DNS threat intelligence. So as you may be familiar with, DomainTools is the best DNS threat intelligence source, and this comes from a long history of over 20 years of collecting and processing DNS type data. So that has allowed us to build a very deep history over time of this data, but there's also a lot of breadth into this data that we have. And this is because we see more domains than anyone else, even in what is known as dark corners, where that final 6% of domains are discovered, found, or processed. We also spend a lot of time and resources in making sure that we try to analyze and gather this data as fast as possible. But one thing worth mentioning also is that we have not only domain data, but also passive DNS, IP data, and a number of other key infrastructure attributes, which you'll learn more about during this presentation. Lastly, it's not only about gathering data and exposing that data, but building predictive products on top of it, such as the one you're going to learn about today. And that is to give our customers a way to proactively mitigate risk inside of their networks. So today we're going to be talking about IP hotlist and IP hosting IP risk feed, and wanted to start with the reason behind why we're building these two, or why we built these two products in the first place. So from a network defense perspective, there is a substantial area of risk involves traffic from a protected environment, meaning from inside your own organization, to threat actor controlled assets. And this connections from your trusted users to these hostile IPs can enable things like malware downloads, command and control communication, exfiltration of critical data from your system, espionage, and a number of other threat activities. Preventing users from reaching these dangerous sets of infrastructure is a major component of any endpoint defense strategy. Given most of the connections are pointed towards domains and not hardcore IP addresses, it's important to build that mapping and be able to assess the risk associated with the IPs, not in isolation, but in conjunction with domains. So in addition to that, what this hostile IPs, there's also an important aspect of IP addresses in general, and that is that they are a key indicator in many security appliance tools, and in some, it is the only indicator that can be used for containment action or to mitigate potential risk from spreading inside the organization. So as network traffic becomes increasingly encrypted, IPs plays an even greater role in having the ability to take action on some of these things. Lastly, it's important also to highlight that there are some limitations in the way that some of the products that are in the market today, because they tend to be more reactive and are based only on confirmed risk. Like I mentioned, network defenders have the need to have predictive signals in order to mitigate risk before it's too late. So that's when, after taking all these aspects into account, we decided to start building on IP hotlist and IP risk feed. So there are important limitations in both the accuracy and the coverage of existing tools. And while many IP addresses host domains that have been registered with malicious intent, sometimes these are not yet seen in industry block lists. So these IP addresses may represent a risk to the organization and are a blind spot for traditional type of tools. Unlike the traditional IP reputation lists, the domain tools hotlist and hosting feed looks at the domains in a different way. First of all, what we do is that we look at passive DNS data to make sure that what makes it into our list is actually active and being weaponized. We also look at the historical data I mentioned that we gather over time and the connections that we build across that data to develop things like our proximity system, that is an internally developed application that basically allows us to relate non-malicious infrastructure with any peripheral activities associated with them. But more importantly, what this product has that a lot of others don't is that predictive element. So we use our domain knowledge and our domain intelligence in order to use the risk attributes of the domains that are hosted in an IP in order to qualify and quantify the gravity of that IP address may represent to your network or your systems. In the process of doing that, we've worked very hard to have a very low false positive rate. And this is because if you think about the IPv4 address space in general, it's something like roughly 4.3 or so billion different IPs. What we're doing is that we're trying to reduce as much as possible the areas that we're having you concentrate, and the hosting IP risk feed is essentially every IP address that has a domain connected to it, and our IP hotlist is a subset of that from only IP addresses that are known to be connected to confirmed bad risk or predicted bad risk. And throughout the course of this presentation, I'll be expanding a lot more on what exactly the criteria for these are. But now I'll hand it over to Pat, who's going to talk about how Bandura has been using this specific product to help their customers.
Thank you very much, Dan. I appreciate it. First, let me say thank you to both you and to Kelsey and the rest of the DomainTools team for having me today. I was very happy when they asked me to help kind of do this webinar today, just to kind of give you a feel for not just what we do, but how we leverage DomainTools and why. As I go through these next couple of slides, I spent a few minutes talking to you about this. What I want you to keep in mind more than anything else is that all of us that are in the cybersecurity industry in any way, we recognize one simple truth, and that is that the bad guys are smart, and we have to be smart too. And as a small business that serves about 300 different customers across all the major industry verticals, we like partnering with smart people. And that's why I'm here today talking with DomainTools, because as we'll go through this, they've done a fantastic job to solve some of the DNS-related problems, and now they're morphing some of that into the IP space, which is really, really valuable given today's security posture and threat paradigm. And on that note, I will move the slide here once I get my mouse in the right place. Okay. This is effectively what Bandura Cyber does. We make threat intelligence, cyber intelligence actionable, and we do that in automated fashion, in autonomous fashion, everywhere and anywhere we can. And we leverage the best of third-party intelligence to do that, and DomainTools is one of our premier partners that enables our solutions to do what they do. So what does our solution do? It does this next slide here, which is this one. And this is kind of like a one-slide fits all that kind of describes exactly what we do. I'm going to spend about a minute here talking about this so you can understand this when we see with DomainTools what we're actually doing with them. So we've partnered with the best of breed that are out there, and our major partnership on the out of the box is with DomainTools. We've been using their domain feed for a couple of years, and we're just now starting to use their IP Hotlist feed that we're talking about today. All that intelligence, and all of our other partners too, in the various organizations, ISACs, ISALs, we have built-in connectors. Basically, any intelligence in the world can be input into our platform. But where we're different is we curate that entirety of that data set in the cloud, in AWS actually, and then we push it out live to all the enforcement devices. So unlike a lot of the players out there aggregating threat intelligence or cyber intelligence, as the case may be, and are doing detection or trying to figure out which things to block, we actually enforce it all. Because in the end, it's great to know you were attacked. We would rather not be attacked. And with the data that DomainTools provides, up until recently it was all domain-based, which is very, very valuable. But then the problem though becomes is that, in the era of encrypted DNS is what about all the IPs themselves, and that's all that you see. And it's very hard for organizations these days to lock down DNS, especially now that all major browsers have back-channel encrypted communications to their own services, like Google's Chrome going to their own DNS and Firefox partnering with Cloudflare and so on. So it becomes very difficult to rely exclusively on DNS data. But the combination of DNS data and IP data is tremendously valuable to be able to protect modern networks. And that's what we do in a nutshell. And then, of course, we can log all that data and send it back, but that's a story for another day. Really, what we do at Bandura is we take all this third-party intelligence and make it actionable in real time, blocking the bad stuff before it ever impacts you in any way, shape, or form. I'm going to move to the next slide here, or attempt to. There we go. So this is just meant to show, oops, I went too far. Let me go back one here. Let's see if this works. There we go, yeah. So this is just meant to show kind of the breadth of third-party intelligence. And, it's funny, like you always hear discussions about quantity versus quality. They're both important, right? To a large degree, cyber is a numbers game. And if you only have one data source that you're basically using to protect yourself, the bad guys will love you. If on the other hand, you're using 15 different sources of smart people telling you things are bad, the bad guys have a harder time, right? And that's what we basically do. We partner with all the best names in the industry. And again, DomainTools is one of our premier partners in the space. And that's kind of what I want to just briefly talk about, is we started working with DomainTools back in 2019, primarily from a domain capacity only. And then as we started talking to them more, we realized that, with their fantastic amount of domain knowledge and how they collect the data and how they determine it and then do prediction based on it, there was a tremendous potential play there to solve the problem from the IP perspective as well. And that's what they've done. And they've done a beautiful job doing it to the tune of, I believe, 50,000 plus, IP indicators, right, of compromise. And that's a tremendously powerful number. And if you're familiar with most next-gen firewalls, they can't actually ingest that much information. But this is why companies like DomainTools partner with us, because our patents, our technology is based on enforcement at scale. So we test even our lowest end box all the way up to 150 million indicators of compromise. And it does so with an order one search engine called a Bloom filter, which enables us to do this at any scale and never impact network performance. So, if you have millions of indicators like they do on their domain lists, or tens of thousands of indicators like they do on their IP list, we're a great partner because we can take all that data in real time and actually block it with no work. And that's what we do. So I'll jump to the next slide here. Why did we partner with DomainTools? Well, for the reasons I said there, but also because we care about data quality. And we understand that as it is a numbers game, the more intelligence you pull into any platform, whether it's ours or somebody else's, the more likelihood you have of false positives, right? And we've made it very easy to solve that problem to the extent reasonable. I'm not claiming to, solve world hunger here or anything, but we make mitigating false positives trivial. And I'm happy to say that we've done a lot of curation on the actual domain IP hotlist data. And we have it in beta right now with a few of our key kind of target areas, and we're going to be releasing it to our entire customer base within the next week. It is prime time, it is ready to go, and we are very, very happy with its overall data quality. And I want to call out one other little thing here about that sometimes in the industry we tend to forget, and that is that a lot of times we've been kind of trained counterintuitively to think that, if I'm already have something on one list, I don't need it anywhere else. I actually vehemently disagree with that. I'm a huge believer that overlap can be a good thing. So when I first got the first alpha data set from DomainTools for the IP hotlist, the very first thing I did was cross-check it against all of my own intelligence to see what kind of overlap existed, to see if they were right about what they were saying. And I started with the top 10. They had all top 10 in there. That is not an easy thing, believe it or not. And the fact that they did told me they were on the right track, that their predictive models were good, and that it was going to be a data source worth partnering with. And that's when I went all in on them and said, I'm going to leverage their expertise tying DNS to IPs for a proper list. I'm going to jump to the next slide here. And there go, the IP hotlist and our partnership with them took off. They were already working on it when I first broached the subject with them back in late 2020 or mid 2020, I think it was August, I wrote it down. And it's funny, I was very impressed by the team there that I talked to. There were 3 or 4 folks in their research part when I first initially talked to before I ever met Kelsey or Dan. And I was very impressed by the approach they were taking to the problem and leveraging their large data acquisition processes and then pulling all this together. And when they gave me that first alpha list, I was extremely impressed by the quality of that list. And therefore, when they asked me to kind of become the first partner with this, I jumped on it right away because I'm in the business, and our company at Bandura is in the business of making sure our customers stay protected in automatic fashion. And this gave us an ability to do that even more than we already had. And I'm moving now to the next slide here. And just to sum up my portion of this before I hand it back to Dan, I am firmly a believer in using all the available intelligence from all the great sources in the world, and DomainTools is such a source. And we were already extremely happy with their DNS domain list. I think today it's somewhere 3 to 4 to 5 million domain names on any given day. It can go up, go down. And now I'm seeing that with their IP hot list, again, it's also kept up in real time the same way their domain list is. that data is allowing our customers to be better protected with the same exact platform with no change, no learning curve, no nothing. They just ingest this new list and it just works. And with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Dan, and he's going to take you through some of the more low-level details of how they implemented the IP hotlist.
Thank you, Pat, for that great presentation. So like Pat said, we're going to dig a little bit deeper and learn more about what makes up the IP hotlist and the hosting IP risk feed, and then walk through some use cases and examples, including the one that Pat just described just in a little diagram. So what you should be noting about the IP hotlist is that we spend quite a bit of time on trying to figure out what was the best sort of criteria to make sure that we ended up with the highest risk of indicators. And the first thing that we did is that we used our access to passive DNS data in order to only include items or IP addresses that had resolutions to a malicious domain, and that could have been a known bad domain or a predicted bad domain. Now, what that does is that the recency of the data is very important, and the relevancy. So if in the last 24 hours there was activity seen to any one of those known or predicted bad domains within the IP, then it makes it into the hot list. Another big important piece here is how we assigned risk to the IPs, and that is, again, a combination of known and predicted bad. And I'll spend some time on the predicted side of things. As you may know, DomainTools uses all the DNS registration data, among other data sets, to create a risk score so that we can quantify what we think is the level of badness of a certain domain according to 3 different threat types, which include spam, phishing, as well as malware. So what we do is that in order for an item to make it to the hot list, 50% or more of all the domains that are hosted in that IP need to contain or need to belong to that category of either known bad or predicted bad. But even doing all this, there could still be the case of having IPs that are not malicious. So we also went and took an extra step to make sure that we avoided known content delivery networks, sets of IPs, but also that we excluded any serial listed infrastructure. And there's an internal processing that we do to our data where we essentially know the true good sets of infrastructure, and we make sure that anything associated with those is excluded from the hot list in order to minimize the number of false positives. Now, when talking about the hosting IP risk feed, what we do is that we give you more flexibility to what you can do with the data. The hosting IP risk feed includes everything that's in the hot list and much more, because we found out that there were other use cases where someone may also be interested in what are the good reputation or non-malicious type of IPs. So in this feed, you have the full spectrum of risk from very low to very high. And what this allows you to do also is that you can think about the different threat types as they pertain to your organization, and you may decide to focus on a specific threat type by customizing how this data is consumed. I wanted to conclude talking a little bit about other use cases besides the one that Pat just mentioned. So we'll start with summarizing what, in a very simple form, what Pat describes. And it could be that there's a number of sources for network data that can include things like network logs, webmail and proxy logs, and also endpoint type of logs. So what an organization can do potentially is extract all the relevant indicators, in this case, IP addresses, and immediately try to validate that traffic against what are some of the known bad IPs which may belong to the IP hot list in DomainTools. If one of the IP addresses that is present in any one of those locations matches what's in the IP hot list, there's a number of things that can be done. As Pat mentioned, it is possible to immediately block traffic, all future traffic to those particular places. But also, in some other use cases, you may want to start an investigation from that as a starting point. As I mentioned, we also have the hosting IP risk feed, which has even more than just the riskiest set of IPs. So what your team can do now is further augment those network logs or network data that you have and try to find other interesting types of risk that may be relevant to your organization. Once you have done one or the other, what you have is a set of priority indicators, which can then be used as pivots and can be combined with existing DomainTools data, which you may be doing already. So what do I mean by that? For example, you may have a set of filtered domains that are linked to those bad IPs. You can use the risk score specific API, or you can use the Iris Investigate UI to try to identify what are some high and low risk indicators from those domains that you just found out through the pivot. If they are low risk, you can end the flow there, but you can continue going further. And from those domains that you may have found connected to the IP, you can try to do additional pivots. And that can be, again, using the auto pivot functionality in the Investigate UI or the Iris Risk Investigate API as well. So if there are guided pivots, again, you can repeat the same process and move further. You can augment that data again with risk scores and do that logic of high and low risk type of indicators. What you end up with here is a new list of items that can either be blocked from your network for preventive protection, but you can also use your existing investigation workflow to dig deeper into these different areas. So as you can have learned, there's a couple of key takeaways here from this presentation. First, we wanted to highlight that we have created 2 new products with actionable intelligence that is predictive and has proven data quality. We have a unique perspective on IP data because it is powered by the domain intelligence and all of our processing of those data sets. And you are now able to do proactive blocking using these indicators or investigation or enrichment, whichever one suits your workflow. And as Pat mentioned, this product is in production and live already with some partners. So if you have any questions about how to make use of them in your organization, feel free to reach out to us. So I'll hand it over now back to Kelsey for any potential, for any audience questions that we may have.
Excellent. First of all, Dan and Pat, thank you for that great presentation. Thanks for all the pats on the back there, Pat, regarding our data sets. Really appreciate the kind words and very happy to work with you all fine people at Bandura Cyber. So we have about a minute left, so we don't have a lot of time for questions. We have time for one here, and let me take a shot at this. So here's one, and I'm going to direct this at you, Dan, which is, does the IP Hotlist technology work with IPv6? Oh, and Dan, you might be muted there.
Oh, apologies. Yeah, at the moment, the output is IPv4 address space only.